The words cut through the restaurant's chatter like broken glass. If you won't do things my way, you're no daughter of mine. My father's voice carried across white tablecloths and crystal glasses. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward us. He slid a check across the marble table, red ink screaming across it, account closed. My hands trembled as I stared at the voided paper. Around us, folks paused mid-air. Whispers rippled through the crowd like waves. I wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and never surface. But something kept me frozen in place. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was the first spark of something I didn't recognize yet. My father stood, buttoning his suit jacket with the same precision he used for everything. When the world humbles you, Mila, you'll understand. He walked out without looking back, leaving me alone with strangers' pitying stares and a future that had just collapsed. The cold air outside burned my lungs. My phone buzzed once, twice, 3 times. Bank alerts flooded my screen. Savings account, frozen. Credit card, declined. Student account, access denied. 22 years of security erased in seconds. I looked up at the glass tower where my father's office sat on the 40th floor, lights blazing like a crown. My reflection in the storefront window showed a girl I barely recognized. Pale face, trembling lips, eyes too wide. But underneath the fear, something else stirred. Something quiet but growing. I whispered into the night air, barely loud enough to hear myself. Fine. Watch me. The words felt strange on my tongue, like speaking a language I'd never learned but somehow understood. I turned away from the tower and started walking, not knowing where I was going, only knowing I couldn't stop moving. Behind me, the restaurant's warm light faded into darkness. My name is Mila, and the night my father disowned me, I thought my story was over. I was wrong. It was just beginning. I'd spent my whole life trying to be what he wanted. The perfect daughter. The obedient student. The future face of his real estate empire. But somewhere along the way, I'd found something he couldn't control. A dream. Not his dream of glass towers and luxury penthouses that only the wealthy could afford. My dream was different. Smaller. Quieter. I wanted to design homes that sheltered people who'd been forgotten. Communities where families could actually afford to live with dignity. My father called it charity. I called it architecture with a soul. That difference between us had been growing for years, a crack that finally split wide open over a single conversation. Now here I was, 22 years old with a degree in architecture and exactly $73 in my pocket. Everything else had vanished with his signature. 1 week earlier, I'd sat in his office with my portfolio spread across his mahogany desk. My hands shook as I showed him the designs I'd spent months perfecting. Modest eco-homes built from recycled materials. Solar panels integrated into roofs that collected rainwater. Community gardens between buildings. Floor plans that maximized natural light to reduce energy costs. Housing that low-income families could actually afford. My father had barely glanced at the drawings before pushing them aside. We don't build charity, Mila. We build legacy. His voice was cold, dismissive. I remembered gathering my courage, my voice barely steady. Maybe legacy should shelter people, not crush them under rent they can't afford. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. His expression hardened into something I'd seen him use on failed business partners. You have 1 week to reconsider. Either you join the company on my terms, or you're on your own. The attic above the old bakery smelled like yeast and sawdust. Rain leaked through a crack in the ceiling, dripping into a bucket that pinged rhythmically through the night. The space was barely larger than my childhood closet. A mattress on the floor. A folding table I'd found on the curb. 1 light bulb hanging from a wire. But it was mine. Every night, I spread my sketches across the warped floorboards and drew until my fingers cramped. The scent of bread baking below drifted up through the gaps, mixing with the smell of pencil shavings and dreams taking shape on paper. I refined my designs, adjusted measurements, calculated costs with supplies I could actually afford. Sometimes I fell asleep with my cheek pressed against blueprints, waking with graphite smudged across my face. The bakery owner, an elderly woman named Josephine, charged me almost nothing. Your father was always too proud, she'd said when I moved in. Pride makes poor shelter. The Riverside Cafe became my lifeline. I'd set up a small table near the water's edge with a hand-painted sign, "Portraits, pay what you can." At first, nobody stopped. Then an old man asked me to draw his late wife from a faded photograph. I listened to his stories while I sketched, adding small details he mentioned. A flower she'd loved in her hair. The way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. When I handed him the finished portrait, tears streamed down his weathered face. Word spread slowly. A mother asked for her children's faces captured. A young couple wanted their first date memorialized. I didn't just draw what I saw. I listened to their dreams and wove them into the sketches. Small touches they barely noticed but somehow felt. A roof garden sketched in the background. Wider windows letting in more light. A ramp for someone who struggled with stairs. The cafe owner, Marcus, started bringing me free coffee. "You see people," he said. "Really see them." The old man in the brown jacket appeared on a Thursday. I noticed him because he was so still, unlike the tourists constantly snapping photos or the joggers rushing past. He sat at the corner table farthest from the crowd, watching me work with quiet intensity. His jacket was faded and patched at the elbows. He ordered only water, paid in exact coins counted carefully from his pocket. I smiled at him once. He nodded but didn't speak. 3 days later, he was there again. Same table. Same jacket. Same careful counting of coins. But this time, when I cleared his table after he left, I found something. A napkin folded precisely beside his water glass. Curious, I unfolded it. My breath caught. Sketched across the paper napkin was a correction to one of my building designs. A structural adjustment I'd been struggling with for weeks. The solution was elegant, simple, brilliant. I looked up, searching for the old man, but he'd already disappeared into the evening crowd. The napkins kept appearing. One every few days, always after the old man's silent visits. Each contained architectural notes that challenged my thinking. Don't design for walls. Design for light. The words were written in precise handwriting below a sketch showing how to angle rooms to maximize natural sunlight. Another napkin contained equations for load-bearing calculations using recycled materials I hadn't considered. A third showed water collection systems that could reduce utility costs by 60%. I started anticipating his visits, my heart racing each time I spotted that faded brown jacket. He never stayed long. Never spoke beyond ordering water. But those napkins felt like lessons from a mentor I'd never met. I began leaving my sketchbook open on my table, positioned so he could see my progress. Sometimes I caught him studying my newest designs, his expression unreadable. Then he'd nod slightly, pay for his water, and disappear. And later, I'd find another napkin. Another piece of wisdom guiding me forward. The breakthrough came on a Saturday morning. I'd spent all night combining the mysterious mentor suggestions with my own vision. The result took my breath away. A home that breathed. Self-cooling through strategic ventilation. Solar panels disguised as decorative roof tiles. Walls made from compressed recycled clay that regulated temperature naturally. Rain collection systems feeding into gardens that, in turn, cooled the building. Beautiful. Affordable. Sustainable. I showed Marcus first, my hands trembling with excitement. He studied the plans carefully, then pulled me into a hug. "This is revolutionary, kid." Other cafe regulars gathered around, pointing at features, asking questions. The energy was electric. But when I looked toward the corner table, it was empty. The old man hadn't come that day. Somehow, his absence felt intentional. Like a teacher stepping back to watch a student stand alone. I carefully rolled up my completed design, feeling equal parts proud and terrified. This was it. The prototype that could change everything. If only I could find someone willing to build it. The fury in my father's eyes was worse than his earlier coldness. He stormed into the cafe 3 days later, his expensive shoes clicking against the worn tiles. "What do you think you're doing?" People looked up, startled. My mouth went dry. "How did you find me? You think I don't know everything in this city?" He grabbed my sketchbook before I could stop him. His face darkened as he flipped through pages. Then, in one violent motion, he tore the book in half. Sketches scattered across the floor. Months of work destroyed in seconds. Gasps rippled through the cafe. I stood frozen, watching pieces of my dreams flutter like broken wings. "You're dragging the family name through mud," he hissed. "Making us look like some charity organization. Playing artist in a street cafe." His voice dripped with contempt. I knelt slowly, gathering torn pages with shaking hands. My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. "These people matter," I whispered. "More than your legacy." He laughed, cold and sharp. "They're nobody. Just like you've become." The video appeared online that night. Someone had recorded the entire confrontation. My father's words echoed across social media, "She's nothing without me." The comments section exploded. Half called me ungrateful. Half called him cruel. I couldn't read anymore. I sat by the river, watching moonlight ripple across dark water. Tears finally came, hot and silent. Everything hurt. The torn sketches. His words. The impossibility of my dream without resources. A white napkin drifted down from somewhere, landing beside me on the stone wall. I grabbed it, thinking it was trash, but then I saw the familiar precise handwriting. "Stand still. The current will turn." I looked around wildly, searching for the old man. The riverside path was empty. Only shadows and streetlights. But the message wrapped around my heart like a promise. "Stand still. The current will turn." I folded the napkin carefully, tucking it into my pocket like a talisman. Maybe giving up wasn't the only option. Maybe standing still and waiting took its own kind of strength. The old man vanished completely after that night. Days passed without any sign of him. I asked Marcus if he'd seen the stranger in the brown jacket. "Not for over a week," Marcus said, concerned. Though I heard from a vendor that someone matching his description sold an old coat at the pawn shop on 3rd Street. My heart sank. Why would he sell his coat? I found the pawn shop tucked between a laundromat and a closed hardware store. The owner, a tired-looking woman, remembered the jacket. "Faded brown thing with patches?" "Yeah, older gentleman sold it 3 days ago. Said he was heading to the hills." She pulled out her records. Left a name for the receipt. Arthur Hale. My blood went cold. Arthur Hale. Those initials stitched into the jacket's tag. And something else. The year embroidered beneath the initials, 2002. I knew that year. That was the year my mother died. I'd been 5 years old. Too young to remember much except her smell and her laugh. Why would this stranger carry that date? My mother's journals had been packed away in storage for 17 years. I'd never looked at them, too afraid of the grief they might contain. But now I needed answers. The boxes sat in Josephine's basement, covered in dust. I opened them with trembling hands. Letters spilled out, dozens of them, addressed to someone named Arthur Hale. I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately, elegant and precise. I read through the night, piecing together a story I'd never known. Arthur had been my mother's business partner. Together, they designed affordable housing projects, revolutionary for their time. Plans for communities that prioritized people over profit. Then my father's name appeared in the margins. Words like betrayal and ownership papers were circled in angry pen strokes. Arthur's final letter to my mother, dated 1 month before she died, "He's stolen everything. The designs, the patents, even our investors. I can't fight him anymore. But maybe someday, someone will finish what we started." I sat back, my mind reeling. My father had built his empire on stolen dreams. The retired builder's shop smelled like sawdust and old coffee. Dominic was 73, with calloused hands and kind eyes. He'd worked with my mother and Arthur decades ago. "Your mother was brilliant," he said, showing me photographs of projects they'd completed together. Simple homes with innovative designs. Communities that still stood, still thrived. Then your father got involved. Started as an investor, ended as a tyrant. He wanted control of everything. Dominic's expression darkened. He convinced the board that Arthur was stealing funds. Completely fabricated. But your father had connections, lawyers. Arthur lost everything. Had to leave town just to escape the scandal. "And my mother?" I asked quietly. She tried to fight for him. Stress nearly destroyed her. Dominic's eyes glistened. "When she died, Arthur came to the funeral, stood in the rain at the back. Your father had him removed by security. Haven't heard from Arthur since, until last month. Someone said they saw him at the Riverside Cafe. My hands shook. He's been teaching me. The envelope was waiting when I climbed back to my attic. Cream-colored paper, expensive quality, slipped under my door. Inside was a blueprint that made my breath stop. It was my design, my sustainable housing prototype, but enhanced, perfected, elevated beyond what I'd imagined. Structural improvements I'd missed. Material calculations that reduced costs by 40%. Community spaces integrated seamlessly. At the bottom corner, 2 signatures. My mother's name in faded ink from decades ago. And fresh beside it, Arthur Hale's signature from just days earlier. Between them, a blank space with my name written in pencil. Below the signatures, a note in Arthur's precise handwriting. Your mother and I started this. Your father tried to bury it. Now you can finish what we began. Build for the people who need shelter most. Make this real. Tears blurred my vision as I traced my mother's signature. She'd dreamed this same dream. Arthur had protected it through years of exile. Now they were passing it to me. The weight of their hope felt crushing and empowering at once. I wouldn't let them down. Building a house without money seemed impossible. But the cafe community surprised me. Marcus offered his savings. The old man whose wife I'd drawn contributed his pension. A construction worker volunteered weekends. Slowly, impossibly, a team formed. We found donated materials. Salvaged wood from demolished buildings. Recycled glass for windows. Clay from a riverbank that nobody owned. The location came together by chance. An abandoned lot by the water, technically city property but forgotten. We worked in secret, afraid my father would find out and shut us down. Each nail hammered felt like defiance. Each wall raised felt like hope taking physical form. The house grew slowly, piece by piece, week by week. I slept there some nights, curled in the unfinished rooms, breathing in sawdust and possibility. We installed the solar panels at dawn, built the rainwater collection system during lunch breaks, planted gardens that would eventually cool the building. When the last board was nailed, we stood back and stared. The haven. Small. Simple. Beautiful. Real. My first completed design. The cease and desist letter arrived at the cafe. Legal papers claiming I was using stolen intellectual property belonging to the company. My father's lawyers demanded I stop construction immediately. Dismantle what we'd built. Pay damages for trademark infringement. I read the letter twice, then smiled. For the first time in months, I felt completely calm. I called the number listed on the letterhead. The lawyer sounded surprised when I spoke. Tell my father I'll see him in court. There was a pause. Miss, I don't think you understand the legal ramifications. I understand perfectly. He stole those designs from my mother and Arthur Hale decades ago. I have proof. Original blueprints with their signatures. Letters detailing his fraud. If he wants to fight over ownership, I'm ready. Another pause, longer this time. I'll relay your message. When I hung up, Marcus was staring at me with something like awe. You sure about this? I looked at the haven through the cafe window, sunlight glinting off its windows. For the first time in my life, yes. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, sealed with wax. I'd spent days preparing it, organizing every piece of evidence, every document that told the Real story. But this envelope contained something else. Something I'd found in Arthur's blueprint package. A partnership contract from 23 years ago. Before my mother died. Before Arthur was exiled. It transferred partial ownership of my father's company assets to a public trust dedicated to sustainable housing. Both Arthur and my father had signed it. But my father had apparently forgotten it existed, buried under decades of other paperwork. The contract was still legally binding. I addressed the envelope and mailed it to my father's office. Then I waited. I imagined him opening it casually, expecting another desperate plea from his disowned daughter. I imagined his expression changing as he read. The realization dawning. The panic setting in. That envelope contained the power to dismantle everything he'd built on stolen dreams. Part of me felt guilty. Mostly, I felt free. The truth was finally moving toward light. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. My father sat with 3 lawyers, his expression carved from stone. I sat alone with my evidence and my truth. The judge, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, reviewed the documents carefully. I presented my mother's journals, Arthur's letters, the original blueprints with their signatures, photos of the haven, built from their stolen designs. The courtroom was silent except for papers rustling. My father's lead lawyer tried objecting, claiming the documents were too old, possibly forged. But forensic analysis had already verified everything. The ink dates matched. The handwriting was authentic. The patents my father claimed as his own were actually filed by Arthur Hale and my mother years before my father joined them. "This is more than a property dispute," the judge said quietly. "This is a question of justice long delayed." I showed photos of the haven's opening day. Families moving into affordable homes. Children playing in community gardens. The architectural innovation that made it all possible. My father's lawyers had nothing to say. My father opened the envelope during the court recess. I watched through the hallway window as his hand shook, reading the partnership contract he'd signed and forgotten. The contract that transferred significant company assets to a public trust for sustainable housing. Legal. Binding. Inescapable. His face drained of color. One lawyer leaned over his shoulder, reading, then sat back heavily. Another grabbed the document, studied it, made frantic phone calls. I knew what they were realizing. This wasn't just about the haven. This was about his entire empire being legally required to fund the very thing he'd spent decades destroying. Housing for people he'd dismissed as nobody. Communities he'd called charity. The judge called us back. My father looked 20 years older. His lawyer requested a continuance, voice unsteady. "Given the new evidence, we need time to evaluate our position." The judge denied the request. "This has waited 23 years. That's time enough." My father finally looked at me directly. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. The world was humbling him, exactly as he'd predicted it would humble me. The media storm broke within hours. Headlines screamed across every news site. Real estate mogul built empire on stolen designs. Daughter exposes father's decades of fraud. Forgotten contract could redistribute millions to public housing. Reporters camped outside my father's office building. His investors demanded emergency meetings. Stock prices tumbled. Business partners suddenly had scheduling conflicts. I walked past his glass tower the next morning. Security guards stood at every entrance. Protesters held signs. Cameras flashed. My phone buzzed with interview requests I ignored. At the reception desk, I left a single item. A key attached to a simple tag bearing the haven's address. No note. No explanation. Just that key. An invitation. A challenge. A lifeline, if he chose to take it. The receptionist stared at me, recognition dawning. Should I give this to him? He'll know what it means. I walked out through the crowd of reporters without answering their shouted questions. Behind me, the tower that represented everything my father valued loomed against gray sky, suddenly looking fragile. The news broke 3 days later. Arthur Hale had died peacefully in his sleep 1 week ago, in a small cabin in the hills. I sat in my attic reading the obituary, tears streaming down my face for a man I'd barely met but who'd changed everything. His will made headlines. He'd left everything to establish a foundation in my mother's name. And he'd named me as his successor, responsible for carrying forward the work they'd started together. The will included a letter addressed to me. "I've been watching you from that cafe for 2 years, Mila. Waiting to see if you'd choose the easy path your father offered or the hard path your mother would have been proud of. You chose conviction over comfort. That's the rarest kind of courage. These napkins, these lessons, they were your mother's wisdom as much as mine. Now they're yours to pass forward. Build homes that shelter dreams, not just bodies. Finish what we started." I held the letter against my chest, sobbing. He'd been testing me, teaching me, believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself. The father who raised me had abandoned me. But the mentor who barely spoke had given me everything. Opening day for Haven's line was perfect. 6 completed homes glowed in golden sunset light, their solar panels catching the last rays. Gardens bloomed between buildings. Children ran through courtyards designed for play and safety. The families moving in couldn't stop smiling. I stood at the entrance, overwhelmed by the reality of what we'd built together. Not just homes. A community. Then I saw him. My father, standing at the back of the crowd. Gray had crept into his hair. Lines had deepened around his eyes. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. Our eyes met across the courtyard. I could have looked away. Part of me wanted to. But I smiled instead. Gentle. Sad. The smile of someone who'd learned forgiveness wasn't about forgetting, but about refusing to carry hate. The ceremony began. I gave credit to Marcus, to Dominic, to every volunteer who'd believed in this dream. I thanked Arthur and my mother, explaining how their vision had survived decades of darkness. I talked about building for people, not profit. When I finished, applause echoed off the new buildings. My father remained still, watching. After the ceremony ended, after families claimed their keys and children's laughter filled the evening air, I found my father sitting alone on a bench. I sat beside him, leaving space between us. The silence stretched long. Finally, I pulled out an envelope. "This is for you." His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a house deed, one of the Havens Line homes, registered in his name. Not as an inheritance or a gift from a daughter to her father. As a chance. A beginning. "This one's yours," I said quietly. "Not as my father. As a man who can start again." He stared at the deed, then at me. Tears rolled down his face, the first emotion I'd seen from him beyond anger in years. "I never knew you had this strength," he whispered. "You never looked." I stood to leave, then paused. "Mom would have forgiven you eventually. I think she'd want me to offer you the same chance. But forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's choosing not to let your mistakes define my future." He nodded, unable to speak. I walked away into the settling dusk. Sometimes, the ones who break us only teach us how to rebuild stronger. My father gave me nothing, and somehow, that gave me everything. The betrayal that destroyed my comfortable life forced me to discover what I was actually made of. Not his money or his name, but my own vision, my own strength, my own stubborn belief that shelter should be a right, not a luxury. Havens Line expanded. 3 more communities were built within a year. Each one designed with the same principles Arthur and my mother had dreamed of. Affordable. Sustainable. Beautiful. Proof that architecture could serve humanity instead of just profit. I never moved into one of those homes. My attic above the bakery remained my space, smelling of bread and blueprints. But now children came there after school, learning to sketch their own dreams. I taught them what Arthur taught me. Build for light. Design for people. Let conviction guide every line. Through the window, I could see my father's home in Havens Line. He lived there now, quiet and humbled. Sometimes I saw him in his garden. We weren't close. Maybe we never would be. But that key I'd given him had opened more than a door. It had opened possibility. And that, I thought, was a kind of redemption both of us could live with.